I also invite next moderator, Rachel Jacobs. Rachel Jacobs is a member of management board and the group council of Springer Nature. She's passionate about the importance of scientific discovery and education, having worked as a teacher in Nepal and holding an undergraduate degree in environmental science from the University of Leeds. And this gives them an opportunity for me to invite Rachel as moderator to the championing diversity, equity, and inclusion commitment in the research. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. If I could invite the other panelists to join me now and turn their cameras on and join me on the screen, that would be fantastic. Let's hope we've managed to connect with everybody. So far, so good. While everybody's joining, let me just welcome you all to this session at the Springer Nature Science and Technology Symposium 2022. Thank you so much for joining us. As was just mentioned, my name is Rachel. I'm a management board member of Springer Nature, but importantly in this context, the champion of diversity, equity and inclusion at Springer Nature. And I've got the pleasure of moderating today's panel discussion on championing diversity, equity and inclusion commitment in research. Today we're going to be exploring the issues and challenges relating to diversity, equity and inclusion, or DEI. Otherwise we're going to say diversity, equity and inclusion a lot in this next 45 minutes. But looking at those challenges and issues in research and endeavouring to understand these from a global perspective. Diversity, equity and inclusion is an issue that runs to the very heart of research. It influences everything from identifying the very questions we're setting out to answer, and therefore what studies are undertaken, through how research is conducted and who is doing the research, and then how research is funded, shared and made accessible to everybody. Understanding how DEI, or a lack of it, influences research is of really critical importance and the first step in us being able to make positive changes. I'm really honoured today to be joined in this discussion by 5 eminent panellists, each of whom bring a unique perspective. I think we've only got 3 on the screen so far, so I'm hoping that our other 2 join us momentarily. But in the interest of time, we'll carry on. But as I said, all our panellists bring a unique perspective to this truly global issue. And I'm going to give each of them the opportunity to introduce themselves with a few words and a bit of background as well. But really honoured that you're all here to join me in this discussion. So first, if I could start with you, Dr. Connie Shimuraway, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and a little bit of background, that would be great. Thank you.
Hello, Rachel, and greetings to all of you who are tuned in. My name is Connie Shimuraway indeed, and I'm primarily an independent science and policy facilitator. But for about half a year, I've also been the director of the Africa Science Leadership Program, which is located at the Future Africa campus of the University of Pretoria. And because that's a Pan-African program, I actually do this mostly remotely. So I am calling in from my hometown of Kampala, Uganda. Back to you.
Welcome, Connie. It's great to have you with us. And then Professor Melanie Wellman, if we can go to you next, please. Briefly introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Thank you, Rachel. So pleasure to be here. It's just this afternoon for me in the UK. I'm actually at a Fellows Conference in Cardiff, celebrating the achievements of our supported Fellows. But I'm Executive Chair of the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, part of UK Research and Innovation. And as well as being the head of BBSRC, I also have Executive Champion responsibility across our activities that span people, culture and talent. So really across the breadth of things that Rachel was talking about in her introduction. So a real pleasure to join you today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ben, if we could come to you next to give a few brief words of introduction, that'd be great.
Thanks, Rachel. Can you hear me all right?
We've got you.
Great. Good. I'm Ben Johnson. I'm the magazine editor at Nature Medicine. So we're one of the journals in the Nature portfolio, Nature's flagship medical journal. My role is commissioning and editing news and opinion content. So I work with journalists, but also with leading thinkers in science, medicine and health who write this content for us. And diversity, equity and inclusion is a hugely important topic for the field of medicine as a whole, and we reflect that in the pages of the journal. I've been in publishing for 11 years now, and before that I was a research scientist working in what was there in a very niche topic of respiratory viruses and vaccines, and a topic everyone's very interested in now. So we have a series on DEI in medical research that's active at Nature Medicine, and we are constantly looking at our policies for how we as a journal can promote a DEI, not just in the journal, but in the wider field of health.
Thank you very much, Ben. Lovely to have you with us. And I did see Dr. Madhu Kati on the screen briefly earlier, so hopefully he's still there. I can't see you at the moment, Dr. Kati. Are you available to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am here, but I seem to be having trouble with the video aspect of this GoToMeeting. Hopefully people can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, just imagine me then. All right, I am Madhusudan Katti, I go by Madhu, and I'm an associate professor in a cluster for leadership in public science at North Carolina State University, which is where I'm speaking from right now. And I'm also, since the past few months, editor-in-chief of the Bulletin of the Ecological Society of America. I'm an evolutionary ecologist by training. My research focuses on urban ecology in particular, and increasingly my work is focused on issues of diversity and inclusion, and in particular the colonial legacies that shape science, as well as shape the ecosystems that we live in. So I'm very much engaged in the work of decolonizing science, and I appreciate being invited to this. I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Katti. And we're endeavouring behind the scenes to get your microphone turned on. Sorry, your video camera turned on. But let's go straight into the discussion. Just to remind the audience, you can submit questions. We will endeavour to get through to some of the questions towards the end of the discussion. But let's start with discussing some of the factors that influence DEI or a lack thereof in research. Melanie, if we could come to you first, it'd be great to hear your perspective from UKRI. I know you take a very holistic approach to this issue because there are so many influencing factors. So if you could talk us through the approach that you're taking and some of the issues that you're trying to address at the UKRI, I think that would be really valuable to share.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, so UKRI has set out its vision for an outstanding research and innovation system in the UK, where, importantly, a diversity of people and a diversity of ideas can thrive. And so with that vision, in order to deliver that, really necessitates us thinking about the system in a holistic way, and recognizing that so many parts of the system are actually interconnected, and that interventions that we might make or changes that we might make in one place will affect other parts of the system. So really trying to think about it in an integrated way and avoiding silos and just looking at things through a very narrow lens. And we've sort of set out actually diversity as one of our sort of principles for change in our strategy that was published earlier in the year. But obviously, if you're taking a systems approach, you have to break that down, because otherwise, where do you focus? What do you actually look at? So we're sort of focusing on 4 key outcome areas in our work across how we're supporting people, culture and talent to deliver that diverse system. So the first one is people. So talented people are obviously at the core of our research and innovation system, the way that we support those people, the way that we attract people into the system, the way that we support people to move to different parts of the system. We are all examples of how we have maybe started in an area of science, but actually we've moved into different areas. How do we support people to move across different areas, across different sectors? How do we attract people into the system? How do we retain people in the system? How do we support people to develop leadership in the system and all that means? The second area for us to think about and that we're considering is the shared values that we need to enable a diversity of people and ideas to thrive. And obviously that is important. I think we would all agree that diversity is critical for excellence in research and for continuing high quality research. So thinking about things around research integrity, what does that really mean? How do we ensure that we are working in that way, both as funders and as researchers within the system? Thinking about equality, diversity, and inclusivity across the board. And earlier this year, UKRI published a draft strategy on EDI, our terminology rather than DEI, but similar, slight differences, but we won't go into the detail of that now. And we're looking at the responses from the consultation, the open consultation that we had around that, and that will inform many of our future activities with the system. Third area is around frameworks that really encourage and support positive behaviours. So this is both our frameworks for assessment, so in peer review, but it's also around our programmes, actually, how and the contributions that people make. Are we really valuing the diverse set of contributions that people make beyond the very narrow specifics around grants that have been awarded, around papers that have been published and where they've been published, as we're hosted by Springer Nature today. So thinking about some of those frameworks, thinking about we're moving towards a narrative CV so that actually those broader contributions can be recognised to bring in more diverse ideas, bring in more diverse people. And the fourth area that we're sort of thinking about in terms of outcomes is around engagement. Engagement that inspires participation, both within the research system, but also for researchers to reach out beyond their own networks, to think about how they engage with the public, how we can support citizen science, how we can support broader dialogue and engagement, I think is really important. I think what underpins a lot of those sort of four areas are having a deep understanding of how we're supporting people as a funder who applies to us, what questions are they asking, who are we funding. So we're very data driven, and we've committed to publishing our data for everyone to access. We continue to refine and expand the range of data that we're actually looking at across equality, diversity and inclusion and all protected characteristics. So I think, you know, as a major funder in the UK, we see we have a really important role in the system and helping to work in partnership to support change and to lead change. Thank you, Rachel.
Right, thank you, Melanie. I mean, that just goes to show there's so much interconnection and intersectionality with diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. I mean, it's so broad, isn't it? And Connie, one of the things I'd really love to talk to you about is more of the work that you've done with the Africa Science Programme, because you know, obviously you've been looking at these issues in that programme, and how did you manage to pull together all of these sort of broad topics and competing issues when you were looking at that programme, and what do you think might be helpful to share, and what can we learn from how you did that?
Thank you very much, Rachel. At the Africa Science Leadership Programme, we recognize that the speed and quality of development of science capacity in Africa depends not only on infrastructure or technical training, but is intimately linked to the quality of leadership that you can to lead change. And in order for that change to come about, we recognized that we needed representative cohorts of scientists each year, and knew that only looking at the university ranking or the scientists list of publications would run us into the danger of reproducing the very inequality that we were trying to overcome. So we purposely targeted smaller private universities, because the program started 7-8 years ago, and at that time, private universities were really mushrooming across Africa. So we targeted those, and we widened the requirement for somebody to have a PhD, to allowing the applicants to motivate how what they do is an equivalent. And you may know or may not know, but actually in Africa, a lot of departments and faculties are run by people who only hold masters, and yet they produce a lot of knowledge, and they train the next generations of researchers. So knowing that context, we allow people to motivate. Also, sometimes when their careers had stalled or where there had been some diversions, for them to tell the story of how they got where they are and why perhaps they might not appear as shiny as some of the other applicants that we had. And in this way, we could reach some really good talent. And I want to say that I was one of the beneficiaries of this kind of approach, because I was at a very small university out in the countryside, not really well connected to the research community, not having been able to research that much or publish that much. And after I joined the community of Africa Science Leadership program, I was connected to the global research community, and actually eventually was selected to join the Global Young Academy that I chaired for 2 years, and recently was appointed as one of the inaugural fellows of the International Science Council. Why? I believe it's because I brought a unique perspective to the research community, mainly as a translator of science, but also illuminating the particular contexts of countries like Uganda. And so now I even lead the program and can continue those efforts to find all the talent across Africa that may not immediately appear as potential science leaders. So I feel that these efforts, keeping diversity within publications like Spring and Nature, can really bring benefits not only to individuals, but to a wider research community.
Yeah, it's very interesting, actually, just picking up on 2 of the 3 themes there. It's something that obviously we're very interested in at Spring and Nature as well. What comes across is the link between education and research, and the work that you were just talking about in terms of broadening the qualifications or the prerequisites or the hurdles that people might need to get through to be able to take a research path if that's what they want to do. And likewise, linking back to some of the things that Melanie was saying when you were talking about your narrative CVs, Melanie, just in terms of enabling people to express a broader range of experience rather than that very narrow sort of traditional experience that is, let's say, it's easier to obtain that experience if you're already in the system in some way. It's harder to be able to demonstrate a broader perspective or different skills or different qualifications that you might be able to offer if you're not in that traditional path. And then finally, Connie, that topic of global collaboration, which I think is just so important, as you said, to be able to bring in different perspectives and global through global collaboration. And Dr. Kati, I know that's something that you've been working on quite a lot yourself, and looking at decolonization and bringing in different communities into the research. So I'd really love to explore that and the work that you've been doing, and how some of these influencing factors of diversity, equity, inclusion, how they manifest themselves in the research that is being conducted, both in how the research is conducted itself, but also then how it is published, Ben, and maybe we can come to you for that part. But Dr. Kati, if you could give us some insights from your own work, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if my camera is visible there.
Yes, it's good. We can see you and hear you loud and clear.
Good. I can't see anyone, but that's all right. Yeah, so my own work for the last few years, I've been focusing on going a little bit beyond critique to look at what we can do to start changing the way science is conducted. And of course, we are all part of Western science as it has developed through colonial processes, and it's sort of the legacy of our colonial history is pretty visible if you pay attention to it across the sciences. So it is important to start by looking at the history and then looking at how it continues to influence the conduct of science now, as well as what we can do to start addressing some of the inequities that have arisen because of that. I haven't
Do you have a
visitor
visitor?
here. Yeah, this is Smokey. He always shows up whenever I'm speaking on camera. Anyway, yeah. So I'm from India myself. I grew up in India. I did my early science, my PhD research in India, but I've been in the US for a long time. So I'm part of this global process of science, as learning it in the sort of Western mode. But I've been thinking a lot about how my own positionality in this shapes my research, and in general, how our backgrounds, our as individual researchers, but also as part of institutions, the shape the perspectives and the kinds of questions we ask in science. So essentially, one of the things I like to tell my students is that in science, we only get answers to the questions that we ask. So asking the questions and asking the good questions is an important part of learning how to do science. But often the kinds of questions we ask are constrained by what we know, what our experiences are, where we come from. They are based on our gendered experiences, they are based on our cultural experiences. An example of this is, if you look at the field of animal behavior, Darwin's thinking on sexual selection, for example, shaped a lot of our thinking for a long time and continues to shape it. But when women started entering the field and doing research, sorry, I just saw something in the text here. Yeah. When women entered the field, perspectives changed radically, especially on things like mating systems and mating strategies of males and females. So, even something that might seem like a relatively simple shift in perspective is actually quite radical. So in that sense, I think it is important to think about having diverse perspectives in science, not just diversity in terms of how people look or what their names are or where they come from, but also what kind of questions they are empowered to ask. And that's the part where I think in the institutions and the establishment of science and the publishers like Springer Nature have a big role to play in terms of providing access to the tools for conducting science as well as for communicating science. And I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of making the entire process of science more accessible and more participatory. And what do I mean by that? I mean, especially when you're thinking about decolonizing, something that I heard Dr. Melanie Wellham speak from the UKRI perspective is the broadening participation in the sciences and sometimes going beyond just the credentialed scientists. I do a fair amount of citizen science. I work in cities on urban ecology, so there's a lot of engagement with the public. And I believe, it's important to engage the public in not just as somebody who communicates my science to people, but also actively participate in the scientific process itself. And I think there's a lot that we can do in that process. And one last thing I'd mention from a publishing perspective is, I'm sure everybody here in the audience is sort of thinking about the cost of publication and how the publishing industry is shifting right now. But one of the things that we're only beginning to see in a few places now is the issue of access in terms of language and translation of science. So, that's an area I'd like to see more work in. And from the Indian perspective, something that I don't see enough of in terms of the critique of how science is being conducted is the issue of caste and caste-based restrictions that have that present unique challenges for diversity in India.
Yeah, thank you. And it just highlights actually that one of the issues that we are constantly working on internally at Springer Nature as a global organization is that diversity, equity and inclusion it's not a unique global issue. It's not a uniform global issue, should I say. It means very different things. It's a very contextual issue as well. and getting that global perspective and indeed a very local perspective on things is really, really important, isn't it? Ben, just coming to you, we've mentioned a few times in the conversation so far about the way that research is conducted and the role of publishers and how then that research is then shared with the world. I wonder if you could share some thoughts on that from your perspective. I mean, obviously as a scientist yourself, but then as well as an editor in how we communicate science.
Yeah, and I think you know, publishers and funders have a huge influence. You know, funders choose what research they're going to fund and prioritize, and publishers and journals choose what research to prioritize. It is a you know, in the end, it's a decision. We as a group of editors, the 10 editors at Nature Medicine, will decide what research we publish or not in conjunction with the scientific community, with our peer reviewers. So we have a choice. What research do we want to prioritize? And I think it has traditionally been the case that research on DEI or the related topic of health equity has not generally been considered a high impact topic and has not generally been published by the top journals. That's starting to change. Certainly at Nature Medicine, we have a series on DEI with a really great selection of articles. And of course, as soon as we announce we're publishing on that topic, we then start to receive more high quality papers. And the topic of health equity is related, it's distinct from DEI. And again, I think that just shows how this is a very complex landscape. You know, we're starting to publish more on health equity, the idea that your background shouldn't affect, everyone should have a healthy outcome regardless of your background. That's absolutely not the case now, and we're starting to prioritize that as a topic at the journal as well. That's really important because most people who research health equity are themselves from underrepresented backgrounds in science, and so if you decide you're going to publish on that at a high impact journal like Nature Medicine, then you're also supporting researchers from underrepresented backgrounds. For us, it's also really important that our own house is in order. And I think that's important for us at the journal, but also for funders and for publishers, also need to make sure that they themselves are diverse and reflect the diversity of the scientists that we serve. And this is difficult. One of the reasons this is difficult is because often we don't have data. We don't have, or we have traditionally not had data on who our peer reviewers are in terms of, for example, gender or ethnicity. So how can we ensure as a journal that we have a diverse pool of peer reviewers if we're not even measuring that? And so we've just very recently started to ask our peer reviewers about information like gender and ethnicity, because it's not recorded in any of our peer review systems. And you know, you would not believe how difficult this is to actually get this information recorded. And actually in some locations around the world, again, depends on geographic location, you are not allowed, for example, to record ethnicity information. Even in health systems, some health systems around the world, there's legislation that prevents you from recording, for example, ethnicity. So what we've committed to doing is publishing. We'll be open. We'll publish the diversity of our authors. We'll publish the diversity of our peer reviews as much as we can. And for our commission content, which is what I do a lot of, there's really no excuse for us not to have a diverse authorship there in terms of geography, ethnicity, age, gender, and everything else. But also, I think the point raised by Dr. Catty is really important around decolonizing science. Talking about what we're publishing on this topic, Nature had a really excellent guest editorial, which I wish I had published myself, which was on how racism and white supremacy is a foundational feature of European science and medicine. And there is a feeling in the medical community sometimes, and the Journal of the American Medical Association has got into a lot of trouble saying, well, no doctor is racist, so how can racism exist? Totally misunderstanding that this is the basis for white supremacy all came from scientists. And so science and medicine this is where these pseudoscientific ideas of a hierarchy of races came from. Francis Galton believed in it. Charles Darwin believed in it. It existed to defend slavery and colonialism, to explain perceived European successes in science and technology. None of this is based on science, we now know, but these ideas, which came from the scientific and medical community, the whole world is living with these non-scientific notions that came from European science. And so one of the other things that we're doing is, where this is particularly nefarious, is in collaborations between, say, like global research collaborations, where historically you had an extractive process whereby information, ideas, samples would be sucked from low and middle income settings to high income countries. We now have a better policy on this at the Nature journals, to say that researchers who publish with us have to say, are there local authors involved in the research? Where will the samples be stored? In my view, it doesn't quite go far enough. I mean, I would say that where you have a collaboration, you need to have all the local samples staying in the host country, so that you have this investment in research infrastructure in low and middle income settings. But we're getting there. We've definitely made some improvements.
Thanks, Ben. And it's one of the purposes of this talk actually is to highlight where we are making some progress, but also where there are still some significant gaps. And Dr. Shimuraway and then Professor Wellman, I'd like to come to you in turn, please. But I mean, first, I know that you've done a lot of work on the interface, Dr. Shimuraway, between policy and science, and just looking at some of the issues that have just been highlighted in the last sort of 10, 15 minutes that are really have been foundational in our thinking historically. How can we make sure that we have representative voices in that interface which is really then setting the tone for what comes after? How can we make sure that we get representative voices there, but not only that they're there, but then they are heard and feed into then the policy that then underpins what comes after?
Thanks a lot, Rachel. I've always felt that scientists do science so that they can change the world, even though they may not explicitly state it. And so it's always been a mystery to me that we mostly speak to one another. And even when we speak to one another, you know that it's not that easy to understand the language, the scientists in a discipline that's different from ours. So one of the outcomes of me becoming a fellow of the African Science Leadership Program actually was for me to quit academia, because I saw this large gap between scientists speaking to one another, really interesting, impactful research on one hand, and the public being informed or misinformed by all sorts of non-scientists, shall we say, or not really very well expressed ideas. And so I must definitely credit Nature as a whole, because I have indeed seen these steps to publish more diverse pieces, and but then I still think that there is more. So you asked what could help more voices come through, and I think the scientists themselves could be speaking more about more general issues, but they just don't have the training to do so. So that's one of the things that I do. I help them translate their science to broader audiences. But beyond that, there are also voices that don't feel that they could speak to scientists, simply because, again, they feel that they don't have the language or the expertise. And so scientists can be the bridge between these, I feel. Yeah, that they could help translate those ideas or partner with them and give them the confidence to express those ideas. So I feel that scientists can also play that part of bridging those voices. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, and I think indeed in the last 2 years, certainly from my own perspective, the ability or the lack of scientists being able to bridge that communication has been really writ large in the pandemic. I mean, every day on the news for the last 2 years, certainly in the UK where I live, you would have a scientist stood explaining to the general public quite complex scientific issues, and likewise you would have politicians trying to explain quite complex scientific issues. And I've definitely seen the capabilities of both over the last 2 years having to be elevated a little bit, because, as you said, that bridging, communicating scientific ideas to the population more broadly has got some way to go, I think. And Professor Wellman, one of the things that has been mentioned earlier, and Ben mentioned it as well, was the role of funders, and in particular funding equity in that part of the system, in doing its part as well in promoting equity, particularly in what research gets funded, and therefore, because everything else then comes thereafter. So I wondered if you could explore how funders are approaching the issue of funding equity, and where are you doing well, and where is there more work to be done, do you think?
So again, all of these things are complex and have many sort of different factors around them. And I think one of the things that we need to look at, and I think Ben was talking about this, is actually having the data, understanding throughout our assessment processes, even before that actually, as we're actually designing programs, setting programs up, and parameters that we set around programs, around collaboration, around engagement with, you know, if you're looking at health inequities, including those groups, including patient groups, if you're actually looking at particular disease areas, looking at people who are actually impacted. I think that's something which I think we can do more around. In the past, when we've been supporting North-South global collaborations, thinking about equitable partnerships has been an important part of what we've done. I think we've got things that we can learn there, but more things that we can move on with. So I think it's both about the program design, but then actually the language that we're using, how are we encouraging a diverse group of people to bring in a diverse set of ideas, rather than, you know, I think sometimes our researchers are quite conservative in their approaches, and they think that we know exactly what it is that we want to fund, and they sometimes don't have the confidence to actually really come forward with some of their really creative ideas. So I think we have to think about how we encourage that and how we support that through our system. And I think we need to understand both who's applying to us, but then who is actually carrying out those assessments, and how can we go further to understand the composition of our panels and our reviewers. I think that's for both ourselves as funders and as publishers as well, to make sure that we are actually getting all those different perspectives, because we know diversity of perspectives leads to better outcomes, whether that's in research, whether it's in the business world. We know that's a good thing, and we need to have that. So I think we are learning through that. We're looking at an end-to-end review of our assessment, peer review assessment processes within this broader portfolio of what we're doing around, sort of particularly around research culture and inclusion within that, and looking at that from all sorts of different aspects and angles. I think for us as public funders, we have certain things that, you know, working very closely with government, there will be government priorities that they will want to be seen to be delivered through the research that we support. But I think it's really important that we have a balance between both that more strategic research, if you like, and actually research which is very open, which is curiosity driven, which is creative, which can support people across disciplines, and having approaches that we can do that's not constrained, I think is actually an important part of thinking about funding equity. Comes back to that, the research questions that we're asking, that Dr. Catty talked about the people doing that research as well. So it's a journey, and it takes time when you're looking at system and to bring people along and to work in partnership. I think but we're making progress. Whether it's as fast as any of us would like, well, I don't know, but we're making progress.
Thank you. So just since we have 2 minutes, I appreciate, I always want to apologise in advance because I know this is a very, very difficult question, given what we've discovered in the last nearly 45 minutes is the breadth and complexity of the issues that we're talking about. But what I would like to do is just ask you if you could only change one thing, and it was only one thing, in order to make progress on diversity, equity and inclusion in research, what would it be? And Dr. Kati, I'm going to come to you first.
Wow.
Or maybe you need a second, but if you could only do one thing, what would it be?
Yeah, it's a big question. There's a lot of things that I've been thinking about and trying to do. But in this context, if there's one thing I could do is I would seriously look at changing the composition of people who are reviewing grants and papers, the peer review process, because that's where a lot of the gatekeeping happens in terms of who gets the funding and whose research gets published, how it's communicated.
Okay.
So that I might make that a priority area to focus
That's
on.
a good one. We'll put it on our list. Dr. Shimuraway, if I could come to you next, if you could only do one thing, what would it be?
I wonder actually who in our community is having the conversation about inclusion and diversity and who decides what this means. Yeah. And I wonder the extent to which we still keep some of our biases and preconceptions in determining this whole conversation. So the first thing I think I would do is really maybe a bit like Dr. Kati was saying, look at the composition of the people who are discussing the issue of inclusion and diversity, in fact, to make sure that we are not just continuing to embed our biases.
Thank you. And Professor Wellham, your one thing.
I think it'd be to raise awareness so that everyone understands that they can play a role in helping to support change, and that way we will accelerate change.
Thank you. And Dr. Johnson.
I think it would be a requirement for co-production, both in research, but also within organizations. So this is a hot topic in health. This is creating services with users, particularly from underrepresented backgrounds, with no preconceived ideas of what that should look like. In organizations, that would be that actually you work closely with people from underrepresented backgrounds to change how the companies run. And again, the key is that leaders have to be open to change without preconceived ideas about this should happen, and researchers have to be open to the idea that actually the research should not be done how they think it should be done, because they're actually hearing directly the voices from the people affected.
Okay, thank you.